It was a late summer morning in a small coastal town, the kind of place where the harbor bell marked the hours, and everyone could name your mother, your first teacher, and the color of your childhood house. In the fourth month after a storm that had changed the weather and the town, a single photograph began to travel from hand to hand, and with it, a secret that would not stay buried. The photograph showed two newborns, tiny and wrapped in a faded blanket, and behind them the hollow face of a woman who seemed to be both frightened and relieved. The scene that followed felt impossible and immediate, like the breaking of thin glass. One death, two lives entrusted, and a promise made on a hospital pillow. Emma had been friends with Lila since they were children, and when the promise arrived, it sounded less like a choice than a summons. She said yes with a voice that trembled but did not break, and the town watched, skeptical and curious, as a life that had been ordinary became an act of devotion. What happened next would test every idea the town held about family, sacrifice, and justice. Could a single promise keep two babies safe when the world around them wanted to take everything away? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine salt on the air, the rubbery smell of antiseptic in a hospital corridor, the soft whimper of a newborn, and the weight of a name that will one day be spoken with pure love. Stay with this story till the end, because it is not only about loss and survival, it is about how ordinary people shape the fate of others with the smallest and bravest decisions. Prepare your heart for a tale of broken promises, unexpected guardians, and a truth that will force a whole town to rethink what family really means. Emma had grown up 2 streets over from Lila, running barefoot through summer heat and learning to fish with Mr. Duarte at the pier. They had shared lunches, confided secrets under the old pine by the market, and promised to always be there, no matter how far their paths might take them. Lila had been the quieter one, with an artist's soul that kept sketchbooks full of faces, and a laugh that came slow and bright. Emma had a steadier hand, practical and patient, someone who fixed things and listened. When Lila fell ill after giving birth alone and quiet, and when a series of events led to her sudden death, the town felt hollow. On the blue hospital sheets, Lila placed her last request into Emma's hands, whispering, "Please take them," as if handing over 2 small sons. That night, the sound of rain on the window was like a soft drum of mourning. Emma promised, and that promise became the hinge of everything that would follow. The weeks that followed the funeral peeled back layers of truth and judgment. Lila's family, once close in appearances, recoiled. Her brother Raphael declared that the babies should go to a distant aunt, and her mother Anna refused the responsibility because of old feuds and the fear of shame. A cousin, Marta, suggested placing the infants in state care, insisting it was the best practical solution. Emma confronted them at the small house where Lila had once painted, and the scene turned into something raw and public. "You cannot leave them to strangers," Emma said, her voice steady but ice-thin. "They are Lila's babies," Raphael replied, avoiding her eyes. "We cannot raise them. We have our debts," Anna said, placing a hand over her mouth as if the truth would spill. A neighbor, Rosa, stepped in and whispered that the town could not stand idle while 2 children were abandoned to paperwork. The debate became a mirror of old grievances, and the infants, wrapped in blankets, lay unknowing of the legal and emotional storms gathering above them. The market gossip turned to murmurs of pity and scorn, and someone began to call Emma a fool for choosing to keep what would bring her burden. It was in this cold of words that an unlikely ally appeared, Papa Joe, an older man who ran a tiny repair shop near the pier, and who had once lost a son to an illness no one wanted to name. He offered Emma a spare room above his shop, a mattress that had been there for years, and a steady presence. "Children need hands," he told her, the salt of the sea in his voice. His kindness was simple, but to Emma it felt like a rope thrown into heavy water. There was no slow transition into this new life. The infants, named by Lila before she died, Noah and Mira, were small and fragile, and Emma learned the rhythms of feeding and sleep in an exhausted blur.
The town watched as the woman who had once been content with a small apartment and a job at the bakery now woke at all hours to soothe two cries that were sometimes simultaneous and always insistent. For the first weeks, dialogue filled late nights, not only between Emma and the babies, but between Emma and those who would shape their fate. At one such late hour, neighbors gathered to offer what they could. "You need help," Pastor Louis said softly, pressing a warm dish into Emma's hands. "We can organize a rota." "No, I do not want strangers raising them," Emma answered, exhausted. "I am not asking for strangers, only for hands," Pastor Louis replied with a patient look. "If you insist on doing this alone, you will burn out." "I promised Lila," Emma whispered, the promise a small bright shard in her chest. "A promise is a tie," Rosa said, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Then we will be your tie," Marta added. Voices rose and fell like tides as the community
negotiated its role. These dialogues, sometimes gentle and sometimes edged with worry, revealed a town that was both a safety net and a tribunal, willing to help but quick to judge. As days turned into months, the practical pains of poverty and the social pains of judgment converged. Money grew thin, as did Emma's sleep and hope. The market, usually a place of warm exchanges and the smell of roasted coffee, became a theater of humiliation when Lila's relatives arrived in a cloud of accusations about Emma's right to the children. "You cannot support them. You have no papers," Raphael told her in front of vendors and customers, his voice dragging over the tiles. "We do not want the scandal," Anna added, her eyes fixed on the babies as though they were symbols rather than flesh. The sound of vendors closing stalls seemed to echo the closing of options. Emma stood by the fishmonger stall where Carlos worked, and he offered small gifts of food that he would not take a penny for. "You keep them fed, and I will cover fish for supper," Carlos said, his hands competent and warm. The tactile detail of wet scales in Carlos's hands, the tang of lemon and salt, the rough burlap of market sacks, all became part of the story. Meanwhile, the municipal social services sent a letter that read with bureaucratic coldness, asking for immediate proof of guardianship and a home inspection. Emma's options narrowed until she felt trapped between paperwork and loyalty. It was in this pressure that another voice appeared, a man with promises and a silver smile, an agent named David Harlow, who said he knew people in the city who could turn a story into an opportunity. He arrived at the market one morning with business cards and a glint that made people wary. "I can place the babies on a program," he told Emma, his words laced with polished certainty. "You are talented. You can be on that show," he said, nodding toward a small poster of a televised talent program. His offer felt like sunlight on a frozen field, warm and dangerous. Before following David's lead, Emma took a moment to tell Lila's story aloud to anyone who would listen, to keep the promise from becoming a fantasy. The backstory of Emma and of Lila needs to be told in their own contours to make the choices that follow feel human and unavoidable. Emma had been the eldest daughter of a seamstress and a fisherman, taught early how to mend a torn sail and how to keep accounts on a scrap of paper. In childhood, she had watched her father wrestle storms and her mother stitch hope into clothing sold at the market. And she carried both lessons into adulthood. She learned the texture of responsibility, how to count change and hold a child without showing panic. Her formation included nights working the bakery dawn shift, the warmth Of dough in her palms, the smell of yeast rising in the oven, and the modest pride of paying rent on time. Loss had touched her in the death of a brother years earlier, a freight accident that had taught her the brittle unpredictability of life. Those early losses accumulated into present choices, shaping a woman whose patience could brood into stubbornness. In the present, she was steady but stretched thin, her hands roughened and her heart made elastic with worry. Lila's presence in her life was both a mirror and a subtraction, and when Emma said yes to the children, she did so with the muscle memory of a life that had learned to repair what was broken.
Lila's backstory was quieter and painted with softer strokes, the kind of life you might find recorded in sketchbook margins. She had been the child of a teacher and a seamstress, raised to see color and shape where others saw only gray. Her formation included long afternoons hunched over charcoal, capturing expressions and the fold of a shirt, learning to translate grief into lines and joy into shade. She had fallen in love with small things, collecting bottle caps and map scraps, dreaming of leaving for an art school she rarely spoke about. Loss came abruptly in a different form, a failed relationship and a pregnancy kept secret because of shame and fear. Lila had tried to navigate the world with those secrets, but found herself increasingly isolated. In the months before her death, she had become pale, her appetite small, her laughter rare. She had whispered to Emma about the children as if they were both a blessing and a verdict. The present for Lila was heartbreaking because it combined fierce love for her unborn with a fear that the world would not be kind. In the end, she made a simple, radical request: keep them safe. That was the last of her directions, a concluding line in a life of sketches and soft rebellion. The two backstories together form the moral and emotional core from which all later decisions radiated, explaining why Emma could not step back, even when every practical argument demanded it. Around this time, the story took a public turn that would begin to shape outside forces. David Harlow, the man who called himself an agent, started telling a different tale to those in the city, hinting at the babies had a viral hook, that a heartwarming adoption story could be packaged and monetized. He said he had contacts at a production company, at a talent agency, names that sounded important in the mouths of those who had never met him. "I can take this story national," he told Emma in a small cafe, his voice smooth and persuasive. "You will have financial security, placements, a chance for Noah and Mira to be set for life." Emma listened, torn between disbelief and the very real need to pay the rent. They exchanged words until the evening light cooled and Papa Joe's repair shop glowed across the street. "What do you want from me?" Emma asked, tired. "I want to help you," David replied. "Sign a simple contract and I will manage everything." Emma hesitated. The scene that followed had 9 exchanges, each one a pebble causing ripples. "Will I see the money?" she asked. "Of course," he said. "Will I make decisions for the children?" "Only the big ones," he answered, smiling. "Who will monitor my rights?" "You will retain visitation," he assured. "Who will file the paperwork?" "I will handle it," he said. "What if something goes wrong?" "Then we fix it," he said, too quickly. "Can you prove who you are?" "You will meet my contacts," he promised. "I do not want contacts, I want guarantees," Emma said. In the end, the contract had small print, and the promise that sounded like salvation smelled faintly of a trap. David's promises initially seemed to unfold into opportunity. He arranged a short televised segment about the town and its resilient new guardian, and sponsors called asking about Noah and Mira. Emma signed over limited management rights, thinking she was protecting her children from a precarious future. For a few shining weeks, the bakery saw more customers, the market buzzed with outsiders, and a woman from a morning show named Sophia interviewed Emma about sacrifice while the baby slept in a borrowed pram. The town felt seen, and for once the chatter included warmth. Then the cracks appeared. Payments were late, interviews stopped returning calls, and David's manner changed from friendly to evasive. The manager of a production company named Lila, who had agreed to consult, called and said he had never met David. When Emma confronted him, the man had an answer that was slick but hollow. "I will bring the contract up to date," he said, sweat at his temple. "I will wire the funds," he promised. The sense of betrayal was sharp, like a paper cut that would not stop bleeding. Papa Joe and Rosa tried to trace his steps, and Officer Brenda began a quiet inquiry. "He has used different names," she told Emma, reading from a thin file. "We have a complaint for fraud," she added. But fraud cases move slowly, and babies do not wait. The crisis that would later define the community's capacity to hold grief arrived like a winter storm in the middle of summer. A fever took Noah in the dead of night, spiking so high that Emma thought she might lose him. She carried him to the small emergency room where Dr. Allen, with tired eyes and kind hands, assessed the situation. In the starkness of the fluorescent lights, the uncertainty that had been simmering boiled over. "We need to run tests," Dr. Allen said. "He could have a serious infection. We will start antibiotics now." Emma nodded, her hands shaking as she handed over the history she did not
fully trust. The medical description was straightforward and necessary. The doctors performed a blood culture, a full blood count, and started empirical intravenous antibiotics while awaiting sensitivity results, observing for signs of septicemia. The procedure was described to Emma in short phrases so she could understand. The catheter insertion, mild pain, the warm flush of fluid under the skin, the beeping of monitors like a mechanical heartbeat. The tests came back indicating a resistant infection that required hospitalization. There, in a bland room with curtains half drawn, Emma faced the possibility of losing a child and, with that, the collapse of the promise she had made. The tension here was not only physical but moral as well, a sharp twofold ache of mothering and responsibility. She thought of Lila in a flash, of a sketch left open on a table. The memories of nights when they had whispered dreams to each other brought a rush of guilt, an internal trial that felt as relentless as the machines. A legal battle began when Lila's family, emboldened by the mounting financial strain and by a lawyer named Miguel who offered a steep but confident hand, petitioned for custody. The courtroom scene was small and claustrophobic, packed with people from the town, whose faces were public judgment cards. There were dialogues that morning that stretched like threads under tension, more than 8 exchanges between lawyer and witness, between Emma and her accusers, each word operating as evidence of character. "You knew the risk," Raphael told Emma, leaning forward in his cheap suit. "I promised to care for them," she answered. "You have no proof you can provide," he countered. "I have proof of steady work," Emma said, presenting receipts, letters from Pastor Luis and Papa Joe, and from Rosa, who had been present in the market the day Lila died. "These are anecdotes," the opposing counsel replied. "Anecdotes become a record," Pastor Lewis interjected, his voice steady and resonant. "She kept vigil and fed the town in hard winters," Rosa added. Officer Brenda testified to the efforts to track David, and Dr. Allen provided medical records that showed Emma's devotion in the hospital nights. The judge, an older woman named Judge Marquez, listened with an expression that softened and then hardened, weighing love against structure. In the end, the judge granted temporary guardianship to Emma while ordering social services to monitor the situation. It was a bittersweet victory, a legal bandage on a wound that needed more than paperwork. The fallout from the courtroom did not end the tension, but it shifted its shape into something communal. David's fraud was investigated, and he was identified in another city for similar schemes, but much of the money he had promised was gone. The community rallied in small ways. Marta organized a rota for morning shifts, carrying the babies while Emma took short naps, and Rosa and Carlos pooled resources to keep food on the table. A local journalist, Helena, wrote a piece that shifted public opinion, portraying Emma not as a fool, but as a guardian who had chosen love over convenience. That article led to a modest donation from a foundation named New Roots and a local entrepreneur, Paulo, who offered Emma a small loan with no interest to fix the leaky roof of Papa Joe's upstairs room, the place where the children slept. The town, which had once whispered about shame and scandal, began to applaud in hushed terms at the bakery and at the market. The gradual recovery was not linear, and there were nights when Emma still felt the cold hand of doubt. But then tiny triumphs arrived. Mira's first steps ran across the kitchen tiles. Noah's laugh returned after a long convalescence, and Lila's sketches, framed and sold at a small exhibition organized by friends, provided a small fund to help with medical bills. The narrative that had once threatened to break into pieces now mended with threads of practical kindness and stubborn community. It was not redemption of a single flash, but a slow, daily recovery that looked less like a storybook and more like a life being rebuilt.
Just when things seemed to settle into a fragile steadiness, an unexpected opportunity forced a separation that tested everything Emma had built. A talent scout, really a different person from David, contacted them after Helena's article went viral on social media. He was genuine enough. His name was Marcus Jude, and he offered an educational scholarship for the twins if Emma would allow them to participate in a program in the city for gifted children. The offer meant distance and the possibility of better resources for Noah and Mira, but also the risk of losing daily contact. The farewell scene was long and full of small dialogues, each exchange stiff with tears and hope. "Will you be okay?" Papa Joe asked, fingers stained with grease from fixing an old radio. "I will visit," Emmett answered. "We will come on holidays," Pastor Louise promised. "Will you call every week?" Rosa asked, dabbing her eyes with an apron corner. "Yes, and when we can, we will be here," Emma said, suppressing the urge to cling. The twins hugged her as if they understood that a different life was beginning. The opportunity was real, the distance measured in train tickets and new timetables. Emma allowed it, and Noah and Mira traveled to the city under the watch of Marcus and a social worker named Elena, waving back from a bus with the town looking on like a small congregation. The separation hurt like loss again, but this time it carried with it the promise of education and of doors that had been closed before. The turning point that led to public vindication came 2 months later when a scandal about David Harlow broke in the neighboring region. Investigations connected his name to several unlicensed contracts and to a chain of smaller deceptions. Local police and Officer Brenda forwarded evidence to a larger task force, and soon the headlines in the city paper named him a con artist. Emma's name appeared too, not as a fraud, but as a woman deceived. The change in public perception was swift and powerful. Those who had once whispered now offered apology and practical aid. The manager of the program where Noah and Mira were studying, a woman named Lucia, wrote to Emma and invited her to a public event where she was recognized for her bravery. The moment of reunion for the family was filmed, hands folding in relief, and the city did what it does best with stories it loves: it amplified them. Yet even as vindication arrived, a new crisis tested their bonds. Papa Joe fell ill, an infection that required surgery and lengthy recovery. The town mobilized. A fundraiser was organized by Paulo, Helena, Rosa, and Pastor Luis, naming him the heart of the community. The medical descriptions of the procedure were practical and clear, the doctors explaining that he needed debridement of a chronic wound and that antibiotics would be administered intravenously with careful monitoring. The recovery was slow, but the collective care reinforced the lesson that family is not solely defined by blood. 3 separate moments of tension stand out as moral tests along this path. The first occurred the night Noah's fever spiked and the hospital lights turned everything sharp and immediate. For 2 paragraphs, the narrative slowed to the interior, the panic and the decisions to consent to aggressive treatment, the memory of Lila's last breath, and the resolution to keep fighting. The second came with the courtroom hearing, where Emma's character was interrogated and the fragile paperwork of guardianship was scrutinized. Those paragraphs explored her internal struggle between pride and fear, memories of childhood austerity, and a fierce determination to not be shamed into abandonment. The third was the betrayal by David, whose smiling promises unmasked a pattern of exploitation. In 2 paragraphs, the account delved into Emma's anger, the sickening realization that good intentions can be manipulated, and her eventual choice to pursue justice through community and legal means. Each of these moments used sensory detail, memory, and the slow crafting of a decision to emphasize that love is tested by reality, and that strength often looks like endurance. The climax of the story arrived when the town, now united, organized a small festival to mark the twins' first birthday and to honor Lila's memory by exhibiting her sketches. The air smelled of frying dough and candles, the harbor reflected strings of lights, and the festival drew a crowd that included the judge who had presided over the custody hearing, the journalist Helena, and even a skeptical cousin or two who came to apologize. Emma stood in a small circle of friends and helpers, holding Mira's hand while Noah chased a paper boat along the gutter. "You kept your promise, Pastor Luis."
"We did together," Emma answered, acknowledging the community's role.
There was applause that felt less like spectacle and more like a communal exhale. David's conviction in a court in the neighboring region came soon after, small justice that allowed for a closing of a painful chapter. With the agent gone, financial repair began slowly but with clear intent. Donations from new routes, Paulo's loan, and proceeds from Lila's sold sketches provided a modest but stable base. The bakery expanded a little, and Paulo offered Emma a small manager position that allowed her to work with hours compatible with childcare. It was not a fairy tale ending, but it was a life recalibrated with dignity and support. 1 month later, the change was practical and tender. Emma had fixed the leaking roof over the spare room and repainted the walls with paint donated by a local hardware store owned by Miguel's sister, Marta. Noah and Mira slept in a crib made by Papa Joe's careful hands. The community had organized a schedule of help, with Rosa bringing soups on Thursdays, Carlos covering fish on market days, Pastor Luis leading a prayer circle once a week, and Helena coordinating a small scholarship fund named Lila's Light. The twins had their first vaccinations, and their health checkups were up to date, thanks to Dr. Allen's attentive records. Financially, the new Roots grant covered the immediate medical bills, and Paulo's loan provided funds to buy winter coats and new shoes. The narrative at 1 month emphasized names and actions, showing that the public had evolved from a chorus of judgment into a network of support. 3 months later, the twins were enrolled in a city program that provided extra tutoring and enrichment classes, thanks to Marcus Jude's more legitimate contacts and Lucia's stewardship. Emma visited them regularly, and during one of those visits, she met a social worker named Elena, who had become an advocate for community-based guardianship. The relationship between Emma and the institution evolved. She was no longer a solitary figure, but part of a vetted support system that included paid caregivers, a pediatric counselor named Dr. Mark, and a mentor teacher named Sophia, who noticed Noah's early aptitude for numbers and Mira's love for drawing, echoing their mother's gifts. Financially, Emma's new position at the bakery allowed for stable income, and the loan from Paulo was being repaid in small, steady installments. The town had become curious supporters rather than critics, and Emma's home was now open more often as neighbors came to share meals and stories. In this period, the narrative highlighted specific names and organizations to show concrete improvement and continuing ties. 6 months later, the transformation was quieter and more rooted. Papa Joe was recovering and had returned to the repair shop with a cane, smiling as younger hands brought in items for fixing. Noah and Mira, now mobile and talkative, had a small portfolio of drawings and numbers that Lucia sent to potential scholarship programs. The bakery had grown modestly, offering a new line of pastries named in honor of Lila's sketches, a small fundraising idea that Helena had suggested and that became popular in the city. Emma had enrolled in a night course on small business management offered by a local community college, and she balanced study with parenting with a rhythm that felt less frantic. The social services agency and Judge Marquez remained involved in oversight for a prescribed period, but their report spoke of stability and strong community ties. Friends from the town, people like Rosa, Carlos, Paulo, Marta, Pastor Luis, Officer Brenda, and Dr. Allen had all been named in reports as positive supports, a constellation that now protected rather than policed. The future looked practical and hopeful rather than flamboyant, and Emma's final reflection was quiet. Family had become a choice enacted daily. She vowed to teach the twins compassion and resilience, to show them Lila's art, and to tell them why promises are worth more than gold. If this story moved you, know that you are not alone in feeling the tug between sorrow and hope. Share in the comments if you have ever witnessed an act of quiet courage that changed a life. Start your reply with "I saw" to make it easier for others to read.
Your stories help build a community where small acts matter, and they give us leads for future videos about people who chose love over convenience. We read every comment, and your words steady others who watch in the middle of the night. Now we return to Emma's life, where ordinary days knit themselves into an honest future, and the promise kept on a hospital pillow was honored not by one person, but by a town that learned to be family. In the end, the story is less about dramatic riches and more about the daily labor of love. There was justice, imperfect and delayed, and there was a form of redemption that arrived through shared meals, through legal papers that protected rather than punished, and through the stubborn hands of people who decided to stay. Emma did not become famous, but she became known and supported. And Lila's children grew with art and numbers in their fingers, and a sense that promises could hold. For viewers, the lesson is simple and profound, that family is forged by the people who choose to show up when it matters most. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Subscribe to follow more true stories of sacrifice and hope, and leave a comment about the moment that moved you most. Remember this one line as you close the video: family is made by those who choose to stay.